Hello, and welcome to this APN webinar. I'm Hadar Susskind, President and CEO of Americans for Peace Now, and I am thrilled to have you all with us today. I'm going to keep welcoming and smiling at you for another minute as other people continue to file into the webinar. So for the first, 44 of you that are in already. Thank you for your patience and bear with me for just a moment. As always, we are thrilled to have you with us. And I am really excited for this webinar today. I'm going to hand it to Ori in just a moment, who will introduce our guests and give you more context. But I will tell you that I have really been looking forward to this. And as someone who has been paying attention to and working, frankly, around the edges of this issue for quite some time, and was lucky enough to speak to Maya and Daniel, I don't know, a year or so ago, I'm really looking forward to this. So thank you both for being with us. And Ori, I'm going to hand it to you for our introductions.
Thanks, Hadar. We are today zooming in on a large organization known as the Jewish National Fund-Keren Kayemet Yisrael, or as people know them by their acronym, KKL-JNF. We will zoom in on their objectionable practices that cause the dispossession of Palestinians and damage prospects for peace. Before we start, the usual housekeeping comments that I'm sure that you are all by now familiar with. This is a recorded webinar, so the video will be posted on our YouTube channel, and the audio will become an episode on Peacecast, our podcast. That'll happen sometime later today. The other comment, as you know, you're invited to ask questions. You can start doing it right now if you'd like. To do that, you use the Q&A tool that's on the bottom of your screen, on the bottom left. Please don't use the hand waving tool because that doesn't work. And keep your questions short, if you may, please. So our guests today are the authors of a new report on the topic of the JNF KKL, and they are Maya Rosen and Daniel Roth. Maya Rosen is an Israel-based graduate student in history at the Hebrew University, and she is an active anti-occupation activist. She's active in such work. And Daniel is an Israel-based educator, writer, activist, and he advances anti-occupation, Jewish-Palestinian solidarity causes. Quite interesting. If we have some time, maybe you can tell us just a little bit about it. If not, Google it, because he's doing some really interesting work. So thank you both for joining us, Maya and Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Sure. You've made things sort of easier for us by preparing a presentation. So before you show it, though, and you should have permission to show it, I just wanted to ask you to tell us just in a few words about why you decided to write the report, what was the objective, and then maybe you can go into the presentation that talks about the report.
Great. Okay. I think we both have a lot to say about this. But I think the early history of the report is we both grew up with KKL-JNF as a major institution in Jewish communal life and our own family lives. And I actually remember the first time that I was at a settlement site in Susia in the South Hebron Hills and saw a placard there that lists it as being a donation of a JNF chapter. And I remember sort of that surprise many, many years ago, seeing that. And as I've continued in activist work, and I know Daniel as well, we've encountered again and again ways that KKL has been involved and complicit in a variety of projects to displace Palestinian communities on both sides of the Green Line. And I think that was sort of a wake-up call to wonder more about this organization. And KKL has been in the news a lot recently, both in Israel and abroad, both for protests this past month in the Negev, but beyond that has been in sort of Israeli media around all sorts of corruption charges. And in February of this past year, there was a vote that KKL had about the organization formally beginning to buy land in the West Bank. This is something that the organization has done for a long time, but wanted to move it into a explicit practice. And that started to garner a lot of international attention as well as in Israel. And I think that was sort of also a moment that spurred us to think, how can we resist not only that particular vote in February, but how can we think more strategically about the work of Cacao more broadly? And it became clear to us as we started to think around campaign and action around that vote that we needed to understand the organization much more than we did. It's a massive organization, which we'll talk a little bit about, and very hard to understand, very opaque. And that began a much longer research project trying to understand how the organization functions.
And just to add, while we were engaged in that research, a second vote came up sort of to further that process after February. So that was going to take place in April, and that was indefinitely postponed. And at least the collective wisdom that we're a part of saw that as happening because it was made clear that it might not pass because of the kind of pressure that was coming from more progressive groups. So one of the things we learned along the way was that there was very clearly something to do. Just, you know, in terms of the something to do, this big question of what to do and what is KKL-JNF and how does it look? And, you know, Maya used the word opaque, which is, I think, a really important word to keep in mind throughout this webinar. Not a single person that we spoke to, people who have been involved in all levels of this stuff for years, claimed to know how this whole thing works. Everyone had a piece of the puzzle, but there wasn't a single person that we spoke to, a single resource that we found that said, oh, we know how this whole thing works. We know how this whole system works. We know the whole history. So a lot of what we put together was an attempt to do our best to piece together all of those pieces.
Great. The floor is yours, so you can start with the presentation if you like.
Wonderful. Okay. So as I share screen, I'll just also mention that Maya and I are in 2 different cities right now, in 2 different countries, and nevertheless decided to try to present this in maybe the most complicated way we could between the 2 of us. So bear with us as we share what follows, which is a presentation version, sort of a short version of the core pieces of the report. There's a million more pieces, and it goes so much deeper than we could possibly go in this presentation. So what, you know, I still encourage everyone who's watching this to go and read that report. So first of all, what is KKL-JNF? What is Keren Kayemet Yisrael, Jewish National Fund? It's founded in 1901 at the 5th Zionist Congress, and its aim was to purchase land in Palestine and surrounding areas on behalf of the Jewish people. It's big. It owns 13% of the land in Israel and had an expected gross revenue of 1.2 billion shekels for last year. It employs over 1,000 people and has 48 offices around the world. KKL-JNF holds an important place in the Jewish communal consciousness. I think that's one of the main driving factors for all of us being here, is how central this 120-year-old organization is to modern Jewish culture, I think we can say. And usually when people look at it, they see this environmentalist, grassroots organization that's supporting Jewish communities in Israel.
And I think that one of the main things that we try to draw out in the report is Cacao has an image largely around tree planting and other environmental projects, which isn't false, but to better understand the organization, I think it's better to think of them as a #1 real estate entity. They have massive amounts of property, and #2 as a huge fundraising operation. And we see sort of those 2 things as the most central core components of what Cacao is.
So it's important, especially for our purposes, to look at the ways in which Palestinian displacement and entrenchment of the occupation have been parts of the effect that Cacao has had in real life. Avram Duvdevani, who's the current chair of Cacao, was quoted as saying, "It's nonsense to say that Cacao has not operated in Judea and Samaria before." That's the West Bank. And he's absolutely right. He is telling the truth, and it's important to understand that that's part of the history and present of this organization. Since its inception, Cacao has aimed to support Jewish settlement in Israel and has done this through the dual tactics of purchasing land and strategic environmental projects. And both of those undertakings have contributed to the intentional displacement and erasure of Palestinian communities, and that continues on both sides of the Green Line to this day.
Great. So like Daniel mentioned in the quote from Duvdevani, the current board chair, Cacao has been involved in purchasing land in the occupied territories since the beginning of the 1967 occupation. In 1968, then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol specifically requested that Cacao purchase land in the West Bank as part of a strategic priority of the state.
In the 70s, Cacao established a subsidiary company, which we'll talk about more later, called Himanuta West Bank. And their express purpose was purchasing land in the occupied territories. And these kinds of efforts intensified, particularly in East Jerusalem, but all over the West Bank in the mid-80s, as Cacao began working deeply with right-wing settler groups like Elad and Ateret Konim. What we see, this image, is a 1991 agreement between Elad and Cacao. And then, a little more evidence of this ongoing history in 2014. Journalist name you should remember if you want to look deeper, Raviv Drucker, I uncovered an internal document that lists just dozens of settlements that Cacao has worked in, supported, established.
I think one interesting thing to note about the report that Drucker uncovered is that in the details of what Cacao was funding in these settlements, they supported all sorts of infrastructure in a variety of settlements, parks and bike paths and things like that. But they also purchased land that settlements that had not yet been built were then built on, including settlements pretty deep in the West Bank.
So we're just going to jump into a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list. That's really, really important. These are just some examples. In Silwan in East Jerusalem, Cacao has been involved in a decades-long suit to evict the Sumarin family, a name that many of you may have heard. Not the only family facing this kind of displacement, but one of the more well-known. Cacao acquired the property through the unjust application of the absentee property law.
And I think we just also want to note that Elad, you might know the name because they run the City of David settlement site in Silwan, and they're an organization that is explicit in their goal of Judaizing East Jerusalem. And so Cacao, in partnership with Elad, with this organization, has settled Israeli settlers in at least 10 Palestinian properties in Silwan and has chosen to pursue evictions against several families.
The Palestinian village of Susia, which is in the South Hebron Hills, it's just another example of displacement, and this is in the occupied West Bank. Here you see an image of fundraising material that Cacao has used, showing their work in Susia, work that has displaced hundreds of people.
Yeah, in the insert, you can, if I'm not sure if it's big enough for you to read, it says that Susia, which we know was once home to a whole Palestinian community, which was forcibly removed from the spot where Cacao is now taking pride in, has turned into an attractive heritage site for visits, education, and a place for private and public events.
And KKL-JNF owned land was allocated to the Efrat Regional Council, Efrat being one of the larger settlement blocks in the West Bank, for the construction of 800 settlement housing units in what's known as E2. And this is where Givat Zitam, which is an outpost, illegal even under Israeli law, now stands.
E2 is an area of particular note and has been in the news recently and for several years. It's particularly problematic because it cuts off the ability of Bethlehem to grow to the south and threatens to cut the entire southern West Bank in two, and has very severe implications because of that for the possibility of a negotiated solution. And their settlements in E2 are built on Cacao land. There are, of course, many other examples that we don't have time to get into. To name just a few, in Machrur, which is near Bethlehem in the West Bank, Cacao petitioned for the eviction and demolition of a home and restaurant that belonged to the Kassia family. In Aramadin, Cacao joined the far-right NGO Regavim in a case that sought the demolition of the entire village. And KKL-JNF was involved in purchasing Beit Bakri, which is a Palestinian home inside of Hebron, the city of Hebron itself, which, as you may know, is one of the most intense hotspots of occupation.
So moving inside Israel, in the Negev desert, Cacao planned to plant a forest on top of the Bedouin village of Al-Araqib, which is something that the residents of Al-Araqib have been fighting against. And it's led to the village being demolished close to 200 times. Means that bulldozers come in and the village is destroyed. And over again, the residents will rebuild what they can, and that will become they'll return to destroy that. And this is all in the name of planting a forest.
And very near to Al-Araqib is also a town called Fund-Keren, where Cacao was complicit in the demolition of that village as well, and is involved in constructing an exclusively Jewish town called Keren on its ruins. And also, of course, in the Negev, as we mentioned in the beginning, are the sites of these very intense protests against attempts by Cacao to use forestation and other means to push Bedouin communities off of their lands.
And if you thought it was just the Negev, it's not. It's also in the north in the Galilee. This is something that Avram Duvdevani, the chair of Cacao, has explained quite clearly that this is what they do. This is not a question for him. This is how they work. They strategically purchase land to inhibit the growth and development of Palestinian towns in the Galilee. They intentionally outbid, this is Duvdevani's language, they intentionally outbid Arabs trying to purchase land in the Galilee in order to ensure that that land remains under Jewish ownership. Oh. So, yeah, it's important that, okay, sorry, moving to JNFs abroad. These are also just a couple of examples. We'll talk a little bit about how the JNFs abroad and KKL-JNF, the body that sits in Israel, interact. But we just wanted to touch on a couple of examples of the way that JNFs abroad, which are in some cases actual totally separate entities in at least sort of on paper. In Canada, JNF contributed directly to the construction of a hilltop settler outpost, again, illegal under international law and Israeli law. JNF USA donates to a recognized hate group, the David Horowitz Friedman Center, and also supports projects like the City of David, Elad's project in Silwan, American Friends of Likud, American Friends of Shavei Hebron, and the Gush Etzion Foundation, just to name a few. And that's all just, these are just a couple of examples, one from Canada and a few from JNF USA.
So we're going to transition now from talking a bit about some of the most problematic work that Cacao is involved in to talking about the structure of the organization itself and how it works. And it's important for us to explain that we see those two components as very much interlinked. In Israel, a lot of the most mainstream criticism of Cacao is not for the entrenchment of the occupation that we just described in these opening slides, but more for corruption and mismanagement Even a 2018 investigative report by the Israeli Justice Ministry recommended dissolving Cacao because of the issues of mismanagement. And for us, it's important to understand how organizational corruption and funding in the West Bank overlap and reinforce one another, that these aren't separate issues, that there's mismanagement and that these horrible things are happening in the West Bank. And to put it in other words, mismanagement and secrecy have led to tremendous spending in the West Bank by Cacao because of the lack of oversight. This includes a somewhat high-profile case of 2 board members of Cacao who spent 100 million shekels on purchases in the West Bank between 2017 and 2020 behind the backs of the rest of the board members. We're not going to get too much into the details of that case here because it's a bit complicated, but it's a good example, I think, of how the opaque and confusing structures that we're going to try and get into now were easily exploited for essentially nefarious political goals. And it means that the organization's very hazy structure made it possible for even millions of shekels to elude oversight. And so for us, because of this understanding how Cacao works, meaning its organizational structure, its decision-making processes, its division of power, its budget, is important if we're going to think about countering the work that we just described. It's hard to give a full accounting, and as we've said, it's complicated. We're going to do our best to just give a very quick overview of what we think is sort of the most important things for people to understand as we think about what we can do about it.
Okay, so jumping into how KKL-JNF works. So here you see kind of the map of where it sits alongside these 4 national institutions as they're known. So the World Zionist Organization sits atop. KKL-JNF, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and Keren HaYesod are the 3 that sort of sit in some partnership and overlap underneath. But I think the main thing to understand is that KKL-JNF, even though it sits where it sits on that map, as you can see, it's actually the most important, it's the most powerful of them. Its budget just completely dwarfs all of the others, including the World Zionist Organization. So it, in actuality, is the most powerful of these 4 national institutions. That said, though, one thing that we learned very quickly was we needed to jump into how the World Zionist Organization, and particularly the World Zionist Congress, the decision-making body or event that takes place, it works, because the board of KKL-JNF is decided by the World Zionist Congress. And even though Cacao's budget sits on top, even though its budget is the largest, the World Zionist Organization actually does sit on top, and that Congress does determine the power. So these elections for the WZO are determined through Zionist federations in diaspora communities and Knesset election results. And here we're going to show you how that actually looks. So,
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, so as Daniel mentioned, the World Zionist Congress meets every 5 years, most recently in October of 2020. And at that Congress, it's determined that leadership positions, a budget of over $5 billion, and a variety of other matters, including, for our purposes, the board of Cacao and other decision-making processes around that organization in particular. And so there are 3 main groups that make up the World Zionist Congress, and thus also Cacao. You can see them in this pie chart here, how they're divided in terms of representation. The first are world unions. These are political slates that are set up in diaspora Jewish communities. They're usually affiliated either with an Israeli political party or with a religious denomination. So Meretz might have a world union that diaspora Jews can vote for, or the Reform movement or the conservative movement also have world unions. Depending on the country, the World Union representatives to the World Zionist Congress are either determined by elections or by negotiations or precedent within the Jewish community. In general, the US has elections for its representatives, but the majority of other countries in the world choose their representatives via negotiations or precedent. The second group that sends representatives to the World Zionist Congress are Israeli political parties. So the delegates from Israel to the World Zionist Congress proportionally match the results of the most recent Knesset results. So in Israel, if you vote for the Knesset, then that is also your vote for the World Zionist Congress. This includes only Zionist parties. So it excludes both Haredi parties and Arab parties who are not explicitly Zionist. And the third group that has representatives at the World Zionist Congress are the Zionist Organizations, which is a set, unchanging list of 11 organizations. One thing that we think is important to note is that the composition of the World Zionist Congress in recent years has been increasingly right-wing. This is not particularly surprising, given that the Knesset has also moved right, and given the fragmentation in the mainstream diaspora Zionist politics, in which the left is increasingly disinterested in Israel and therefore less likely to vote, and the right is increasingly vocal on Israel. And so these two trends together, both in Israel and abroad, explain the shifts that we've seen in recent congresses.
Okay, so here we see kind of a more internal map of how KKL-JNF looks. Because Cacao is under the WZO, its board is proportional to those World Zionist Congress results. 25 seats on the board mirror those results, and 11 more seats are decided by who will sit on them by those Zionist organizations that Maya mentioned, and it's 1 seat per organization. Seats are divided among the same 3 groups as the World Zionist Congress, so the World Unions, the Israeli political parties, and the Zionist organizations. Under Cacao sits these 2 subsidiaries, Himanuta and Himanuta West Bank. Both act as purchasing arms for Cacao. And so here, pause to explain that Cacao in 2016 changed to become a public benefit company. This was something that then Justice Minister Tzipi Livni pushed forward a couple of years before that. This basically, for our purposes, means that they have to have more transparency. But both Himanuta and Himanuta West Bank are private companies. This means that there's relatively little oversight because they don't have to do as much reporting. To clear up any confusion for those who maybe have read a little further or know a little more about Himanuta, in 2019, Cacao began referring to something called Himanuta Jerusalem. It's again, for our purposes, think of it as a nickname for Himanuta West Bank. It's not a new entity, and it's called Himanuta Jerusalem, basically to cover up the kind of work it's doing in the West Bank.
Great. I think this is a good moment to just make 2 notes about Cacao's finances. The first is about where their money comes from. And one thing that we found is that the vast majority of Cacao's money is coming from its real estate holdings and not from donations. This is an important point, I think, as we think about how we're going to counter the work of Cacao. But just to give an example, in 2019, Cacao's revenue was 2 billion shekels. 84% came from profit in real estate holdings, which are managed by the Israel Land Authority, a government body, and only 4.5% came from donations. The rest of that, the gap is from partnerships with the government, with other institutions, etc. And another thing that we found in reading many financial reports from Cacao is that they haven't reappraised the value of their land since it was purchased many decades ago. And so while official documents state that Cacao land, not including Himanuta, the subsidiary's land, is worth 3.7 billion shekels, we realized that this is based on the purchase value. And we've estimated that the true value is something more like 250 billion shekels, which is 67 times more than what they're reporting. And from conversations with a variety of people, our understanding is that this is to avoid government control or interest in that land.
Cacao in the state. Here's another quote from our friend Avram Duvdevani, the current chair. as long as the state of Israel exists, they will need JNF, which does things that the state does not do for one reason or another. This is a quote from last month with regard to the actions in the Negev, the attempt at planting and the protests that followed. The state of Israel and Cacao have a mutually beneficial relationship because Cacao allows the state to carry out its wishes under the guise of a private company, public benefit company, but a private company that doesn't have to serve all the citizens in the state of Israel, even though Cacao is quasi-governmental. We'll get back to what I just said a little more later, but it's also important to know that Cacao it's really not separate from the state. 6 out of 14 seats on the Israel Land Authority are filled by Cacao. That's 43%, and decides on that body. The ILA decides on distribution of land as well as planning and development priorities.
Yeah, and I think exactly like Daniel said, Cacao has tried to portray itself like an NGO, and we think that there's something pretty deeply misleading in that, given the immense influence and access the organization has in Israeli halls of power. And to just clarify this point about the difference from the state is that the state, at least nominally, has to work for the benefit of all of its citizens. We know that there are discriminatory laws on the books in Israel, but that's at least sort of the veneer. Whereas Cacao, in its founding documents, is meant to be a trustee of land for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone, which means that Cacao does not lease land to non-Jews, including non-Jewish Israeli citizens. There's a variety of ways in which the state has benefited from the way in which Cacao has a different mandate, and in many ways an advantageous mandate, but one that the government itself cannot take on, which is essentially what Duvdevani is saying in that quote that Daniel opened with. This goes back to the very foundation of the state. In the early 1950s, the state transferred Palestinian refugee land to Cacao, specifically in order to avoid having to give it back should it be pressured to do so in accordance with international law after the passing of a UN resolution that said that refugees have the right to return to their lands. We now have documents that have been uncovered that show that Israel got very nervous about what that would mean for land that it took, and specifically gave it to Cacao because it wouldn't then be state land, it would be private land. And there's a variety of ways that we continue to see how this arrangement is a clear benefit to the state itself. When the former board chair, Dani Attar, finally agreed to more oversight of Cacao just a few years ago, Likud MKs, members of Knesset, stepped in to thwart that process because they realized that a lack of oversight was actually good for increasing land takeover in the West Bank, which was one of their major goals.
Okay, so some tension regarding this relationship. The JNF, in relation to being an owner of land, is not a public body that works for the benefit of all citizens of the state. The loyalty of the JNF is given to the Jewish people, and only to them is the JNF obligated. The JNF, as the owner of the JNF land, does not have a duty to practice equality towards all citizens of the state. We really wanted to emphasize this. I said a brief thing a moment ago. Maya dug deeper into it. Now you can see this is a quote from Cacao's JNF's response to a 2004 case that Israeli NGO called Adala brought, challenging the legality of Israel Land Authority tenders because some of them were only for Jews because of this KKL-JNF policy. So, we just really need to emphasize that this is the basis of this organization. It owns 13% of the land, and it's only responsible to the Jewish people. It's, as for those who read the report, a state within a state.
And specifically the state connection, I think we want to emphasize is that Cacao is has 43% of the seats on the Israel Land Authority, which is the highest land planning body in the state of Israel. And it's a body that should be bound by non-discrimination, and Cacao is issuing tenders through that body, which lease only to Jews. There was, in addition to the 2004 case, which we've quoted here, there was also a 2016 case in which Adala, the same NGO, along with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and the Arab local councils, challenged Cacao's position on the Israel Land Authority because of the issue of discrimination, and they lost the case.
What can we do? So what follows now, we're in the home stretch. What follows is a mix of suggestions for Israelis and internationals, activists and NGOs, and everyone in between. This isn't a detailed program. We're not laying out the strategy. What we want to do is cite some of the directions that that can and should be combined so that all of these different people in geographic and organizational locations can work together on. It's a basis for a conversation and for building a strategy going forward. So one of the first things, and something we mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that we think is the reason that that vote on sort of clarifying purchasing in the West Bank was postponed so far indefinitely, is pressuring Zionist organizations on the Cacao board. Again, there's 11 of them. They take up 11 of the seats. These organizations operate around the world, and they have the power to significantly shape the decisions made by the Cacao board. They often vote to the right, even though most of them self-identify as apolitical, we can say. And because of that self-identification, we think that there's a lot of potential for pressuring these groups.
You want to do the next slide, Daniel? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we just wanted to actually dive into this particular point a little bit more deeply and give an example here. So this chart that you're seeing on your screen is the election results of the February vote about purchasing land in the West Bank. You have in the leftmost column those who voted in favor, those who voted against, and then the one abstention. And we've divided the votes by the Israeli political parties, world unions, and Zionist organizations, as we discussed in terms of discussing the structure of the organization. So what you can see here is that in terms of Israeli political parties, the green entries in this chart, they were exactly tied. The same number voted in favor as voted against. In terms of the world unions, the slates of diaspora Jews, one more voted against. Meaning if it had just been Israeli political parties and world unions, the vote would not have passed. What happened then is the Zionist organizations more voted in favor than against, although you can see it was very close. 2 more voted in favor than against. This means that even if a few of the Zionist organizations had changed their vote, it could significantly change what would be a major Cacao policy that would have implications on tremendous amounts of land. And among the organizations that voted in favor of purchasing land in the West Bank include organizations like Maccabi, which runs the sports tournaments that we might have heard about, and Na'amat, which is a group that at least nominally is affiliated with the Labor Party. Pressure then started on these organizations, and the final vote on the West Bank land purchasing, which was supposed to have been in April of this past year, was postponed and never rescheduled because it became clear that it might not actually pass. It could still be rescheduled, but I think it shows that this strategy has potential, that pressuring the Zionist organizations is something with a lot of political potential. It could be a crucial pressure point to either pressure these Zionist organizations on appointing more progressive representatives or on particular votes. From talking to a variety of people, it's become clear to us that often these organizations don't even know who their representative is on the Cacao board. They hand it off to some Israeli staff member who in many cases is more right-wing than the organization itself. There's really no reason that Maccabi or Na'amat, along with a few others, should have voted in favor. These are, as Daniel said, ostensibly apolitical organizations. They certainly have no mandate regarding settlement expansion, but at the moment there's no cost to them voting in favor. And so a right-wing representative is free to vote as he or she wishes. putting pressure on these organizations or on the programs that they run could change the calculus and could mean that there actually is a cost for supporting deeply discriminatory policies. And we think that there's at least 4 organizations of the 11 that either abstained or voted in favor that with the right kind of campaigning could be prime targets for shifting.
Great. So we're gonna try to run through these other directions quickly so we can get to some questions, which I am sure there are. Playing in the Zionist electoral arena. The Cacao board is determined, as we've said, by the WZC elections. Shifting the composition of that Congress will shift Cacao's practices. This can be done in a few ways. Get out the vote campaigns.
So this would mean campaigns in diaspora Jewish communities for more progressive slates. For example, the Hatikva slate, which ran in the most recent elections, and I think there's reason to think that with more resources and more time for Hatikva to gain greater name recognition, it could increase its representation significantly. In addition to growing other slates that often vote left of center, including the reform and conservative movement slates, there's a lot of potential to grow voter turnout, and especially the religious movements have the infrastructure to potentially do that. The Forward estimated that voter turnout for the 2020 elections was 1%. This was double the voter turnout from 2015, in part because everything around the World Zionist Congress has become more politicized. But given that 1%, there's still lots of room to grow. And working on encouraging people who don't vote more than shifting current voters seems to us to be a good way to go. This comes with a grain of salt that it could backfire in the sense that the right could also do this and could very well outpace us. But there are real numbers that we think are possible here. In 2020, in the United States, a given slate would need to get 16,260 votes to add on its own a seat of whatever variety it would want to the Cacao board, for example. Hatikva got 7,936 votes in 2020, so it was about 8,000 and about 16,000 are needed for a seat on its own. Upping 8,000 to 16,000 or to 32,000 for 2 seats on the Cacao board would be a really big push, but they're not numbers that are totally unimaginable.
And we'll just jump through the other 3. There's a bunch more to say about these, but I think we'll just sort of touch on them. Thinking strategically about how to work within Zionist federations in diaspora communities. Again, the federations are the ones that hold those votes or make those agreements. Working in the Israeli electoral sphere to push for more progressive Knesset results. As we said, Knesset results impact the makeup of the WZC. So, working in that sphere will impact that, and working to encourage progressive diaspora Jews to take leadership in Cacao. We jump into this a little more in the report, but as Maya said, there's a lot of room for different representatives to bring different viewpoints, shall we say, to the actual meetings that take place.
And I think we think of, there's many ways in which the left has some systemic ways that it's set up to fail in the Zionist electoral politics arena in terms of our numbers and structures and priorities. But I think one way that we've thought about it is a little bit like doing work in either Congress or the Knesset, that this is an area in which there's tremendous amounts of power and resources and importance, and they're too important to fully give up on. But we also know that they're not our only avenue of action, that just like only working in Congress will never achieve the full progressive agenda that we hope for, but we wouldn't fully give up on a legislative angle. I think so too is how we think about the World Zionist Congress.
Yeah, $5 billion are decided in that space. Nationalization. In many ways, Cacao land is treated as state land, and there's an inherent logic to the idea that that land should be run by the state. Putting aside anyone's thoughts about what that would, what that would entail and whether that's better or worse, just as other pre-state organizations were dissolved or incorporated into the state, so too could Cacao's land be nationalized. And its other activities, the activities perhaps we point to as positive environmental activities to the Ministry of the Environment, a body that exists.
And this is something that even Yair Lapid pushed for nationalization in 2015 as a way to weed out corruption in the organization. And so even if it's for different reasons, this is an approach that could potentially garner more mainstream Israeli support.
Nullifying the treaty between the state and Cacao, we jump into this a lot. We dive into this a lot in the report. But the vast majority of Cacao's budget, 84% last year, as Maya pointed out, comes from its, or in 2019, from its real estate holdings. Nullifying this 1961 treaty could hit their budget in a significant way. It also might have other potentially negative effects, but it's worth examining what the pros and cons of this might be. The legal option. There's currently a debate within the board about whether the organization's memorandum of association, sort of its constitution, particular section 3A permits purchasing land in occupied territory.
Yes, the phrase under debate is that Cacao operates, quote, in the state of Israel in any area subject to the jurisdiction of the government of Israel. And the question is whether Area C is included under the jurisdiction of the government of Israel. Both sides have brought legal opinions supporting what they believe. There could be an advantage to us to maintaining a murky status quo rather than being definitively ruled against in court. But it's also possible that a favorable ruling would be obtained, which could be game-changing, and even a loss could potentially become a media win in terms of bringing attention to the issue of land purchases in the West Bank.
Making Himanuta into a public benefit company. As we mentioned, Cacao is a public benefit company. It means more oversight. Making Himanuta, potentially both of them, into public benefit companies could create more oversight for the work that they're doing in those organizations. International banks. So although Cacao receives relatively minimal funding, again, it's not a lot from JNFs abroad, it could still be useful to target these institutions because of the public impact, the PR impact, the popularity of this name, the myth of JNF having holes poked through it could have an impact on what JNF actually does on the ground. So there's a few ways of doing that, challenging JNF charitable status abroad. This is something that happened in Canada by a group called IJV, Independent Jewish Voices, pressuring international JNFs through activist campaigns and encouraging the cessation of donations to JNFs abroad, all again with the purpose of changing this green image, the greenwashed image of KKL-JNF and its work on the ground. And finally, creating alternative institutions. It's important to know that a lot of also, like Cacao is a giant organization. It supports all kinds of stuff you disagree with and all kinds of stuff that I bet many people on this call would support. And so it's important to think about all of the groups that get, in some cases, large amounts of funding from Cacao and how they can step into a movement that's opposing this kind of oppressive reality without risking having to close their doors. So, the example we used in this is, an alternative institution like the Progressive Israel Network, of which APN is a part, is an example of an institution that's been built in the last couple of years that could be a supportive body for the organizations that don't want to shut their doors because they don't want to, because they want to speak out about the kind of work that Cacao is engaged in, that's displacing Palestinians and entrenching occupation.
Right. So that sort of concludes our directions for future action. I'll share just a couple of concluding thoughts before we're happy to open it up to questions. I think sort of after doing all of this research, it feels like it's very hard to challenge Cacao. It's huge, it's well-funded, it's opaque, but we really think that this work is crucial. The work that Cacao is doing touches on all of the most important issues in Israel-Palestine today, on occupation, settlements, Palestinian refugees, Bedouin communities, discriminatory legal frameworks, and much more. It really is an organization that touches at the sort of the crux of justice in the land. The rightward shift on the Cacao board in recent years mean that its pretty horrible political goals are more out in the open than ever before, which provides both a challenge and also an opportunity, I think. It's hard to know when change from within is still possible and when an institution has become so problematic that we should withdraw. And I don't think we have easy answers to that question. But I think what we do feel is that if we've learned anything from the right and how the right has risen to power in the national institutions, it's that we have to play the long game and we have to think strategically. And so however that's done, we feel very excited about working with other organizations, with activists, with people both in Israel and in the diaspora to think together about how do we take this information and counter the problematic work being carried out by KKL-JNF.
And I think with that, we can open up to questions and comments and concerns.
Great. Well, first of all, just thank you both for that presentation, and even more so, frankly, for doing this work. You know, a lot of the things that you talked about, the World Zionist Congress elections, the PIN network, the Hatikva slate, APN is part of that. Some of you who are on, I'm sure, know that before I was at APN, I ran the campaign for the Hatikva slate for the World Zionist elections. And there's so much more that we could talk about around there. But I think the work that you guys have done to dig in and help us understand really the enormity, because I think that's a challenge that so often people run up against when we're looking at the JNF, is it's so big and it's so complicated that I know for us this will be a powerful tool, and I think for many others we have a limited amount of time for questions. So I'm going to be quiet and turn it to Ori quickly to share a question or two we've gotten from the audience. Or you're still muted, but maybe you can throw 2 or 3 out real quick.
Right. So we're really going to. I'm going to explain how we're going to do it. We have just a few minutes left, and we always like to have Jim Klutznick, our chair of the board, who just joined us, say a few words before we finish. We have lots of questions. I think that most of the questions are actually answered in the report. So I'd really encourage people to read the report. And what we'll do is this: if you still have questions after you've read the report, send them to me, and then I will share them with Maya and Daniel, and we'll have them answered in some way, either on our website so that everyone can see them, or individually. Maybe just a quick thing to explain. Again, I'm just choosing one question here out of many, but when you say that Himenuta and JNF buy land, buy real estate, who do they buy it from?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Either way, I think Himenuta is sort of the active purchasing arm of Cacao, and so there's Himenuta Israel and Himenuta West Bank. The vast majority, and I think they can buy from all sorts of people, from private individuals, from sometimes there are land swaps with the government, etc. The vast majority of land owned by Cacao, though, is not owned by Himenuta, which does own some percent. I think Himenuta West Bank owns something like 15,000 dunam of land. Is that right? Compared to Cacao itself, which owns 2.5 million dunam. I think it's also important to know that of the 2.5 million dunam that Cacao itself owns, not Himenuta, 1.5 million of that was given to it by the state and is Palestinian refugee land from the early 1950s. So a little bit this line that we hear that that the land that Cacao has was bought with the money that our grandparents put in the blue boxes. To some extent that's true, but also the majority of it was taken from Palestinian refugees who were never compensated for it.
And then maybe one more quick question before we turn it to Jim. What is the relationship between JNF Israel and JNF USA? We have a few questions that relate to this relationship in the Q&A.
So officially, they're separate entities. They're separate in actually name, in a way. In one of them is an American body, JNF USA, and one of them is an Israeli body since the early 1950s when it moved from England to Israel as its base of operations, Cacao. And so JNF USA has also, in the last 2 decades or so, whittled down the amount of money that it gives to Cacao. It's quite a limited amount. I think in the last couple of years, I remember during our reading, I saw one year that JNF USA brought in something like $100 million in donations and gave like $1 million to Cacao to work with. JNF USA, of course, is working on the ground and doing all kinds of, taking part in all kinds of projects. But they are officially separate entities. But I think one of the things that it's important to understand is that's not what most people understand. Most people see that the logos are similar, the name is similar, they share a history, the way they talk about themselves on their website, JNF USA, it muddies that water a lot. It uses the overarching 120-year history of JNF as its own, while simultaneously trying to distance itself in sort of the cultural ether.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask Jim to unmute himself and say a few closing words, and then we'll bring the webinar to a close.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you, Maya and Daniel, for this really outstanding report and analysis of the situation. You know, I clearly am the oldest person on this call, and so I'm going to represent the older generation that was raised in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and some of us are still around today, with the deception and obfuscation that you so well portrayed, with us putting our nickels and dimes in what we call the push key, the little blue and white box, and getting all the tree planting certificates for bar mitzvahs and all kinds of confirmations, every kind of celebration. This was the ultimate deceit of this whole thing, and it was going on well before us. It's sort of in the ether of modern Zionism from Herzl going forward, and you guys have done a great job of portraying that. The one thing the two things I want to say before I stop here. We've all seen in recent years human rights reports that talk about the erasure of this line, the blue line, the green line. It is the green line, and how this is going on both sides of that line. And we also talk about the de facto annexation that's taken place. You guys have presented that in great clarity. And I think ultimately, from our standpoint, we're a peace-seeking organization, and we're going to look to to that process as well to add to your strategy to pressure the United States, it's Jewish people, it's people in general, and the world through the quartet, for example, with the United States and the EU, along with the UN, and dare I say the word today, Russia, that's in the quartet. Maybe they'll start to behave at some point, to pressure both sides, but particularly Israel in this case. And we better start recognizing what's going on here. You've really clarified it very well, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And as people can see, the presentation was the large part of this hour, partially because it's nearly impossible to get into this subject without digging into all of it to understand the layers and the overarching picture. So apologies for taking up the entire hour, not getting to a lot of questions that I see there. There are many in the Q&A, but also we had to.
Right. No apologies necessary.
No, we thank you both again for joining us today. Thank you for this work. Just so as Ori mentioned, I think at the beginning, we will be sharing, on our website, our social media, et cetera, the recording of this podcast episode from it, et cetera. And again, if folks did have questions that you typed in that we didn't have a chance to get to, or other things you think of, please reach out to us and let us know. We will answer them. We will share them with Maya and Daniel. Ori just put his email in the chat for anybody who wanted to do so. And once again, we thank you all for being part of this movement and for joining us. And I'll urge you right now to vote in the next World Zionist Congress elections. Thanks. Bye, everybody.